Well, welcome again. We're glad to have everyone here with us this beautiful evening to celebrate this season of Lent. It's a blessing for sure for me to be able to begin this journey with you all. Last year, I had the opportunity to do my first Ash Wednesday service, so this is round number 2, all right? So if you were here last year, you're back. Yes! And if you're new with us, hopefully you'll be back for round 3 maybe next year, all right? But what a blessing it is to be here and to begin this Lenten journey in our church. This is such a special season. We go through Christmas and it feels like we go straight from Christmas right into Easter. And so, but what a blessing to start our season of Lent with our Ash Wednesday service here in Broken Arrow. So I want to start with a question as we begin to reflect on this passage that Sam and Luke just read for us from the book of Isaiah. And what I want us to think about is, have any of us ever been in one of those situations where we're going to do something for someone, but we're also going to get something out of it? Anybody ever been there where you kind of like, there's some situation that you know that you can lend a hand, you can be helpful, or you could contribute, or you could do something, but really there's a motivation behind it that maybe is not so pure as just to helping that person, but maybe there may be some self-worth that can come out of it. So we're like, oh, well, I'm going to do this and it's going to help them, but really I want to do it and it's going to be a win-win because they're going to win out of it and I'm going to win out of this situation. And I think about those instances of where we've been placed in those, and whether that's been in the workplace for us or whether that's been in school or even within our families, right, where we make a deal. We make a deal and we try to make this deal sound really good for the other person, but really it's like a score for us. We're like, yes, they bought into it, right? And I feel like that's kind of where we find ourselves in this passage with Isaiah. This is a huge book. Isaiah is considered one of the major prophets of the Old Testament, all right? And one of the most well-known passages that we know out of the book of Isaiah comes from Isaiah 53 about the spotless lamb. And here we are a few chapters later, and God tells Isaiah, he's like, look, dude, I need you to really bring the fire to these people. And it's like, all right, can you imagine being the prophet back in the day? Like bringing these words from God to the people, and how many toes were stepped on, or maybe just whole feet were stepped on as the prophets were proclaiming these words that God had instilled in their hearts. And so I think about this passage and how in this story, God sees beyond what these people are doing and really sees what's going on internally and their motives and their intentions for why they might actually be drawing close to the Lord in a fast, as we read and as we heard. And so in this passage, Isaiah calls out the Israelite people. He sees their righteous acts of fasting and praying and wanting to draw close to God, but he also sees beyond that. He sees to the heart. He sees the self-motivation, the self-driven desire to draw close to God, to maybe hopefully redeem something or get something, almost to make a deal with God, that I'm going to draw close to God, that God might bring this deal and drop it in my lap as well. And that's kind of what's going on with these people that Isaiah is calling out in this passage. And it's kind of heavy, and it's kind of one of those passages that we look at and we're like, they were speaking to the Israelites. Thank you, Jesus, right? We're like, they're not speaking to me. This is the Old Testament. Okay, this is the Old Covenant. We're no longer under this. We're in New Testament days. We love Jesus, okay? And it's like, that was the angry God of the old covenant, and we don't do anything with the angry God anymore. It's all about squishy Jesus in the New Testament that is full of love and joy and all of these things. But is it only that? Is that only the thing that happens in the New Testament with Jesus? Because I had Sam and Luke read that passage for us, not because we're going to spend a whole lot of time in that passage about fasting, but I want you to see a foundation in which Jesus might be actually trying to communicate from when he speaks out of Matthew chapter 6. And that's going to be the passage that we really spend our time in together this evening. And so everybody knows about this famous Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus has this real sermon after sermon after sermon. You know, you could imagine people are like, all right, when is this guy going to be done? Like, seriously. And so Jesus is constantly speaking about these truths about how these people need to be living their lives and how they need to be seeking out God. And really, you know, what we find out in the beginning of Matthew's chapter, before all of this happens at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, look, I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And at that point, it's like, dang, Jesus. It's like, so what? So I've come to not just get rid of all these things that we've learned or that we've studied or that we've heard about, but I've come to fulfill them. I've come to take what we've gotten, and I've come to raise the bar. And as we read through the Sermon on the Mount, there's some situations that Jesus is speaking to. He's talking about anger, and anger's the same as murder. And it's like, wow, I was angry this afternoon, right? Or it's like committing adultery is not necessarily sleeping with that person, it's looking lustfully at that person. And so Jesus just takes this and he just raises the bar up for us and says, look, come on, this is where I need you to be. This is where I want you to reach for. This is how I need you to strive after me. And so that's where we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 6. In verse 1, it says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their full reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. It's like, all right, Jesus, you see that I give, you see that I serve, and you're still calling me out. Ouch. And I think about stories in which we read about, especially around Christmas time, right? Christmas time, we always hear about those famous stories where people go into Walmart, right? And they find out about all this accumulated money that needs to be paid off for these people's gifts that are on layaway. And you hear about this millionaire or whoever this person is that comes in and just writes these checks and pays off all the layaway items, and people have Christmas. And what a miracle that is for those families, obviously, that are recipients, and they never know who bought those gifts. And I kind of believe that's kind of what Jesus is telling us what our lives should be like. That when we give, we don't know what this hand is giving or this hand is giving, right? That when we serve, we're not going out to serve so that other people can give us butt slaps or hand claps because of what we've done or accomplished, or that we're a good person and we've done great things. But how many of us want that? How many of us are guilty of that affirmation that when we go out and we help people, that we want to be recognized, that we want to be seen as that person that, moved all these mountains so that these certain people could be taken care of? We want that recognition. That's not bad, but is it? And testimony, it was like, well, what about testimonies? What happens when that occurs? Like if God uses me to do X, Y, and Z thing, how do I tell people about it? How do I help them connect to God and see God at work through these situations? And how do I serve people? How do I go help them without them knowing who's doing it? And there's a difference between that and us telling people about what we did to help that person, right? And it's kind of convicting to me personally. All right, this is something that I've been wrestling through the last couple of weeks that I've been thinking about this evening as we've are here together tonight. And our world recognizes this, right? In our world, all of us have probably seen those GoFundMe pages, right? And on those GoFundMe pages, if you've ever donated, you see an opportunity to put your name or to be anonymous. And how many people have we seen on those pages want to be known? There's not just this giving because we just see a need and we want to meet the need, but we want to be recognized when we meet the need. And Jesus is just hitting to the heart. I mean, he is hitting to the heart of these people. He sees their good works, he sees their good deeds, but then he just says, look, you're missing it. You're missing the whole point here. He said, you've received your reward just by that, by hearing and seeing other people seeing what you're doing. It goes on to say in verse 5, but when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like those babbling pagans, right? For they like to be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for the Father knows what you need before you even ask him. And so Jesus goes from giving and serving to talking about prayer and our prayer lives. Now, I would say none of us, not a whole lot of us are guilty of probably this one in a sense of like, when we get in a room and everybody's like, okay, it's time to pray. And it's like, oh, don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact, right? It's like, everybody looks down, it's like, oh, there's a pastor. Let's look at him, right? It's like, let the pastor pray. And so we're probably not as guilty of this one in the sense that Jesus is calling out these people and these religious leaders and their prayers and how they're, presenting themselves and their righteous acts and their service for God, right? But then he goes on to talk about fasting, okay? There's a little section in between prayer and fasting where we learn the Lord's Prayer. That's where we get the Lord's Prayer is in Matthew 6, all right? But then it picks back up in verse 16. It says, but when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others their fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put on oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And so we can see this common thread from the giving and the serving and the praying and now the fasting of doing things in secret. Almost being like Navy SEALs for Jesus, okay? Like you're the person who is behind the scenes helping people encounter Christ without getting any of the recognition or the affirmation for what you're doing. And so as I think about this particular passage, I see a very close connection to what Jesus was trying to draw from the prophet Isaiah's words in Isaiah 58. To help people recognize their fasting may not have been motivated for the right reasons. They might not have been doing it for the right reasons or the right intentions after all. And so as we begin this journey together, there's three things that I really want us to process through and to reflect on as we start this journey. And the first one is this. It's less about our righteous mimicry and more about getting right with Jesus by repenting. You see, the prophet Isaiah saw, really it was God who saw through it all and used the prophet Isaiah to call it out, but he saw through people just putting up a show of their faith, showing their righteousness off to the world, but really inwardly there might have been other things going on. And so my thought is, as we reflect on this journey through Lent, what would it be like if we would put down that imitation Christian that we put on for people to see so that people know that things are great and well and everything's happy and I'm doing everything I could this morning. I prayed 4 times already before I got out of bed. All right, I prayed in the shower. I read my Bible 3 times before I got to school. Put that away and get right with Jesus by repenting. What would it look like if we turned our hearts to the Lord every morning? We said, Lord, I need more of you. I'm sorry. Like the brokenness that I caused in this relationship or the thoughts that I had, Lord, forgive me. What would happen if repentance continued to lead the way through this journey of Lent? The second thing I want us to think about is that it's less about giving up chocolate or Cheetos or chips or soda or coffee. And I know I'm stepping on all the toes in the place this evening, right? It's not about that. And trust me, I'm just as guilty, right? I gave up coffee one year. That was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. Now, let me tell you, that was before children, okay? I will never, if somebody takes my coffee away, they're dead, right? They're meeting Jesus after that. But it's not necessarily about giving up these things and, I can't have my sweets today. I didn't have my chocolate cake. Isaiah says it's about tearing down injustice in the world. It's about seeing brokenness and seeing needs out in our community and saying, I'm going to be a part of changing this. That's what fasting is. It's about going out and recognizing that there's people that are hungry here in Broken Arrow, in the Tulsa area, that need something. And here we are. We're fasting from our chocolate cake. Maybe we can use that $10 to go buy them lunch. Here you go. There's a start. Restore Hope does a really cool program. Restore Hope in a way to raise support and awareness for what they do. Restore Hope is our partner ministry that serves people in the Tulsa metro area with, it's like a food pantry, but they also help with other types of assistance. And what they do during the season of Lent is if you say, well, I'm going to give up 1 meal a week. And they say, okay, well, how about you contribute whatever that cost of that meal would be and contribute it to Restore Hope and what we're doing in trying to remove people off the streets of homelessness and to provide meals for people. They're doing it right. They're seeing needs and meeting them. And so I believe that it's about us going out into the world and helping and serving and doing something. And it's different for each of us, right? Because what breaks your heart is going to be something that breaks mine. And so what breaks your heart that you see injustice that you have to do something about it? And you don't know how, but you say, Lord, I need you. I need you to help me do something. Recently, I've been getting lit up by Jesus reading these news stories about young children being abused by their parents. And not just physically abused, sexually abused. And my heart just breaks. I read these stories. Yesterday I read one, there's somebody Bartlesville, and the 8-year-old kid. And I just wanted the non-Jesus side of me wants to beat the crap out of these people. But what do? And that's scary. Because when you begin to pray those things, Lord, break my heart for what breaks yours, you better watch out. Because crap's about to get real uncomfortable in your life. Things will be really uncomfortable because things will change. Because God will call you to step beyond the comfort into something that saves, that brings healing, that tears down those injustices. The third thing I want us to reflect on this Lenten journey is that it's less about others observing our religious practices and more about our Creator observing our sacrificial devotion. See, Jesus said, get into the quiet place. Get into the quiet place and seek me. Give and nobody knows what's going on. But we all want recognition. We all want to be cheered on and patted on the back because we did something great. And I'm guilty of it. This happened 2 weeks ago to me. I had the opportunity to go and speak to most of these young people here at their winter retreat down at Sky Ranch. So I was gone for that Sunday and was really praying about what God would give me to minister to these students, because I wasn't the speaker for the whole weekend. I was the reliever, for those of you who are baseball fans, okay? They brought me in the 9th inning to finish off the retreat. And so I had been talking with James Hunt, who was one of our associates here, and he was the speaker for the weekend, and he had to leave Saturday night. And him and I had been talking for a couple of weeks. Well, what am I going to talk about? And I had to bring everything from the retreat to a close. I had to just bring it all in and just package it up and go, students, go save the world, and no pressure, right? Because I didn't know what was happening there all weekend. And so I drove up Sunday and had this word that I felt like God had given me to minister to these young people. I was like, oh, this is going to be good. This is going to be fire. This is going to light them up. And they're going to feel like, man, I've got to really make some changes in my life. I got to go home and do X, Y, and Z. I just felt like, oh, this is it. And so I get up on stage. I get up and I start preaching. And I look out, and half of the room is like this. I mean, I'm not kidding. They're dead tired. They're worn out. They're just exhausted. I mean, which I get it. They've been playing all weekend. They've been worshiping Jesus all night long, the night before. They've been eating camp food, junk all weekend. They're tired. They don't want to sit in one more worship service and hear this guy bring some word to them. They're ready to go home. They're checked out. And so I'm trying to give this sermon, just trying to keep composure and be, it's dang. And so I come down off the stage and I'm like, here's where the bar was. I was down here. I felt swing and a miss, right? Strike out. And I mean, I just felt like I just bombed the weekend, and I'm just that's it. I've come down the stage and I'm, I just take some moments to reflect. And somebody comes over to me graciously and says, that was a really good sermon. Like, that really spoke to what I'm walking through right now. And that was like, well, thank you, you know. But I still felt like I had missed the mark. And the reason why is because most of the time, I'm not going to try to blow myself up too much here, but most of the time when I preach, like, I get people that tell me, good job, like, that really ministered to me. Like, people text me, like, I get phone calls like, hey, this is how God used your message to help me through this situation. And that's all amazing, and I appreciate all the words of affirmation and encouragement. But the problem is was I seeking that? Did I desire that? Did I feel like I had missed the mark because I hadn't received the affirmation that I thought was needed for that sermon, for that moment, for those students? And so I drove my way back home to Broken Arrow, and I'm all like mopey and like, this, I did terrible. Like, this is my worst sermon. I told Larry, I told our staff, I was like, it's terrible. Like, my wife, she could see me. I walk in the house, I'm all dragging and say, what's wrong? I'm like, it was awful. It was the worst thing. I'm never signing up to be the relief pitcher at the retreat anymore. Like, go, just pour me, like, shut up, Graeme. Like, I needed a Jesus slap big time. And so you want to know what my wife said? She said, let me tell you something. She said, you got to stop seeking the affirmation of people. And you need to be faithful to what God has instilled in your heart to minister. I said, yes, ma'am. But we're all guilty of that, right? We're all guilty of wanting that affirmation and that praise. And as we begin this Lenten journey, Jesus is saying, back off. Back off. Find me in the quiet. Find me in that secret place. And amazing things can happen. You see, in the words that Isaiah we read earlier, it said, then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. And then your righteous acts will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guide. He goes on to say in verse 11, then the Lord will guide you always, and he'll satisfy your needs in the sun-scorched land, and will strengthen your frame, and you will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. He says, look, if you focus on the right thing, you won't have to worry about the rest of it. He said, you will be taken care of, you will be nurtured, you will be prepared for whatever you will face and encounter in this season. And we say, well, that's fine. Like, that's the Old Testament. Like, that's your Israelite people, Graeme. Like, but Jesus said, no, right? Jesus isn't ever done with us, right? In Matthew 25, we read about this story about the sheep and the goats, right? And Jesus separates, right? He's like, these are the sheep, these are the goats. And people are like, well, what's happening here, And Jesus has this encounter with these people in a very real way. He said, look, when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was lonely, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to see me. Right? And that's what he says to the sheep. And to the goats, he's like, when I was there in those moments, you didn't clothe me. You didn't feed me. You didn't visit me. And he goes on to say in verse 40, he said, the king will reply, truly I tell you, this is to the sheep. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did it for me. This is one of those heavy times in the church when we really get to dig into Jesus, that we really get to allow the Lord to just lay us bare before him and to just say, look, search me, God. I want to be more like you. I want to know you more. I want you to use me in this world. I want you to transform people's lives through me. And we have to get out of the way. We have to allow Jesus to do it. You see, there's this common thread as Jesus is speaking in Matthew 6. He says, but when you. He doesn't say if you. He says, but when you. He said, maybe you will. No, he says, but when you. So I'm not worried about what you're going to do when you leave this place, because Jesus will tell you what you need to do. You don't need me to do that. But when you go do those things, when you observe your Lenten journey in the light of these scriptures, guess what happens? You see the face of Jesus. You see the face of Jesus because you step into the brokenness in our world and you say, I can help this situation. I can solve this problem. I can fix this. So may these scriptures guide us as we begin this Lenten season together. May these passages guide us and direct us to a place of repentance, to a place of humility, to a place that we can be more like Jesus. Let us pray.